Good morning. My name is Saul Midler and I'd like to welcome you to our Align.me webinar entitled Right-Sizing Your Business Continuity Capability. It's interesting, this topic comes from a discussion we were having in the office on why many organisations had a business continuity capability that wasn't supporting the needs of the business. We went on to discuss this in a bit more detail and talked about why ITDR seems to be the only real or tangible form of business recovery the organisation had. So hopefully I can add some value to your thoughts on this topic as well. So I'll just advance the screen. So for many retailers with an online presence, non-stop online availability is paramount to your operations. The website itself must be fully functional at all times, and without it, inevitably, that CIOs will have to deal with hostile CEOs, hostile boards, and hostile stakeholders. Their concerns will be focused on a variety of impact categories, including damaged reputation. And this is an interesting one. Customers become uncomfortable from buying your products or your services. Their perception may be that you're just not big enough. At a personal level, or at an individual level, managers can also lose their job. And last year we saw this with the CIO of Target in the USA having to step down. Loss of revenue, that's one of the most obvious ones, I think. Customers just won't buy from you and they'll buy from your competitors. And that can also lead to loss of market share. Customers will never buy from you again if you're off the air for a significant amount of time. There's another side of this too, the legal side, the legal ramifications. You may have customers with service level agreements in place that may have penalties and they may seek financial compensation, which again probably perpetuates the damage to reputation angle as well. So, question, have you right-sized your business continuity capability? This assumes you know what your business capability is and what your needs are. And so for the rest of this presentation, we'll talk about a variety of facets that focus on whether you've got the right balance of business continuity for your organisation. So in some ways it comes down to this concept of exposure. Are you simply relying on your disaster recovery for IT systems, for example? I guess intuitively you know that you're highly dependent on your technology capabilities. But business is more than just technology, and I think this is the core to the conversation that we were having in the office. The physical entity of the business can often be overlooked when thinking about ITDR. So why? Well, because all online organisations occupy some form of physical space. And when disaster strikes this area, it can be just as devastating as IT failure. For those with a virtual offering, this can be head office, as in physical head office building and so on, or your data center where your technology operates from. And for those who provide physical goods, then this could also include a broader aspect of the business such as warehousing, maybe delivery, supply chain, suppliers themselves and so on. So you may already have a business continuity plan in place to minimise the effects of these problems, but is it enough? My experience in the BC industry for over 20 years is that most organisations just don't know. Organisations do implement some capability, but it's not necessarily in tune with what the business needs. The skeptics and the cynics. One key reason I think why this situation exists is many execs don't actually believe that they'll be struck by a disaster, or they've put inadequate resources into their business continuity program while focusing exclusively on their technology disaster recovery capabilities. And this is, I think, probably a common question. Why do we need to build a plan since we've never had a disaster? Well, we have to probably think about this from a different perspective. There are a wide variety, probably an infinite list of disasters. If we look into the media and we think about what we've read and what we've watched on television, well, we should acknowledge that disasters strike all the time, and not just overseas, certainly in Australia as well. Whether it's pandemic or fire or flooding, as we can see here in Rockhampton, or bad weather or cyber terrorism, there's always something that we have to be concerned about. I'll give you a couple of examples. So this is a piece written by Taiping Chen for the Wall Street Journal. I'll let you read it for just a moment. And I think the interesting aspect about this is they just don't know how long it will be before they reopen again. And this is a very large organisation. I'll give you some other things to think about with this concept of disaster, interruption, disruption. When Katrina hit New Orleans, the stats were quite incredible. 6 months after the disaster struck, 50% of the 82,000 businesses in that New Orleans district never reopened. That's a pretty horrifying stat. 50% of 82,000 businesses never opened. If we think a bit more broader than that, in America, we've probably all heard of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. In 2013, they declared a major disaster or emergency every 3.5 days. If we bring things back, back closer to home in Australia, if we remember Cyclone Larry in 2006, that caused $1.5 billion of damage. It destroyed 10,000 homes. And if we want to look at things from, maybe a left of field perspective, 80% of the Australian banana crop was destroyed, which was interesting. Federal government doesn't allow the import of bananas into Australia, and we saw the price of bananas increase by 400 to 500%. So disasters do strike, and they do cause havoc and mayhem, and there's lots of downstream implications of it. But the question still, I guess, lingers there. What's the likelihood of an operational disruption striking? I'd like to present some stats. So these stats come out of the UK. They've been facilitated by an organisation called the Chartered Management Institute, and they run the same survey each year, and they've been doing it for the last 10 years or so. I acknowledge that it might be a bit difficult to read these. I'll only pop it up just for a moment. It basically lists the various type of threats that organisations said that they were facing in 2013. In other words, if an organisation declared a disaster, what was the threat? And we see this list. At the top of the list, we can see extreme weather. And if we think about, the UK, we might recall that in the media we saw lots of examples of flooding, for example. And look, in Australia too, we've had lots of flooding, both in Victoria and in Queensland over the past few years. If you go down that list, I don't think you'd be too surprised in terms of, what the list says. Things like denial of access, loss of electricity, loss of key skills. Towards the top, loss of IT, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Industrial action, even down the bottom where we've got fire. I mean, fire is one that we often think about, we often consider when we're thinking about business continuity, fire taking out a building. In reality, the statistics are quite low. Only 4% of the 637 companies that responded to the survey said that they declared a disaster because they were struck by fire. But coming back up to the top of the list there, we can see extreme weather, loss of people and loss of IT. I'm going to just zoom in on the loss of IT and just talk about that in a bit more detail. So in 2013, 40% of those organisations declared a disaster because they lost IT. A percentage, unfortunately the report doesn't say, a percentage of those were online businesses just like yours, which is a pretty staggering statistic, I feel. And if you look at the stats over the last few years, since 2008, you'll see that those stats are pretty high, somewhere between 35 and 40%. And in fact, in the first three periods, 2008, 2009, 2010, loss of IT was the most prevalent cause for operational disruption for the surveyed organisations. And in 2013, it's the third highest one. So even though, intuitively we know and understand and feel that we have this great dependency on technology, we don't seem to be protecting ourselves adequately enough. And certainly these stats, would show that. I like these statistics for one key reason. They do focus on the UK, but I think that in Australia we have the same socio-economic climate as they do in the UK. I think these stats are fair and reasonable to consider, a similar sort of profile for here in Australia. And maybe weather might be a bit more extreme over, in Europe, in UK than here. But I think the rest of these categories actually do reflect what we might face here in Australia. And unfortunately, there is no one running these sort of surveys in Australia. So to plan or not to plan, that is the question. And I've had lots of discussions with people about this. You know, do they still need to put time and effort in here, or should they just respond on the day and do the best that they can and you know, hope for the best? These stats also come out of, you know, that report from the Chartered Management Institute, and they basically said that organisations that did have business continuity capabilities in place and suffered a disaster, only 36% of those, so about a third of those organisations, suffered a reduction of revenue, whereas over half the organisations that were surveyed that didn't have a business continuity capability suffer a reduction in revenue. So at a statistical perspective, you can see that there is absolutely merit in having a business continuity capability here, certainly in the area of revenue impact. So I guess it comes down to, you know, what is business continuity? I've made mention of this many times in this session so far. Let me give you our definition. I mean, you can Google BCM, of course, and you'll get quite a wide variety of definitions. And some of them are tailored to different market sectors. But I'll give you our definition, and if you like it, feel free to use it. Effective business continuity management ensures that your organisation has a level of operational resilience appropriate to support the needs of the business as defined by its corporate objectives. So the first component of this definition is to remind us that whatever capability we build, whatever procedures we write, whatever arrangements we put in place, has to support the key reason why we're in business. So it's to focus on your corporate objectives. The second component is that you have the capability to continue to provide your customers with critical services and products regardless of any operational disruption. So here's this, you know, the focus on continuity. And I've underlined two key words here. The first one is a reference to critical services. The modern day BC philosophy does not require you to develop capabilities for everything that you do, only the critical ones. And when I mean critical, I'm talking about time critical ones. The other aspect about this is the underlining of any, regardless of any operational disruption. And that supports the modern philosophy about business continuity, that it's the all hazards approach. In other words, it doesn't matter what the cause is, let's make sure that we can respond and recover and get the business on its feet. You wouldn't want to be the CEO in front of the media that sheepishly stands there in front of microphones and cameras and says, well, you know, we had a pretty good program, risk management, business continuity. We thought about all the scenarios that could strike us, and we're really sorry, we just didn't think that event could actually happen to us. We're really sorry, you know, we'll have our products or services back on the air within 3-4 weeks. You couldn't do that. That'd potentially kill the organisation. So all hazard says any operational disruption. And it means not thinking about scenarios. It means thinking about your critical activities and your critical resources and how to replace those. The third component of the definition, it allows you to maintain appropriate management practices into business as usual to ensure that your business continuity capability always reflects the need, the technology and the structure of the business. So think about that. Think about your own organisation. Think about how much has changed over time. People come and go. Departments merge and restructure. Organisations restructure. Geography changes. You used to be in this building, now you're in that building. You now got, you've brought in a new business or a new service line or a new product offering. That change has to reflect back into your BC capability so that you're always prepared. So as I said, if you like this definition, feel free to use it. But it actually does break down those three components: business, continuity, management. So let's come back to your organisation and think about this. How did you end up with the continuity capability you have? And of course, I'm assuming you have some level of business continuity capability. The driver for your capability may come from a variety of different perspectives. And I guess we see a lot of this through the engagements we have with our clients. And I've just highlighted 4 key ones, 4 typical ones that we see out there. Let's see if any of these align to your organisation. The first one relates to service level agreements. It's very usual, it's very typical that an organisation will establish an SLA with a service provider, let's say an IT DR service provider, based on how much money they're prepared to spend on that facility. So it's really couched around, I guess, a budget allocation or a budget target, not necessarily tuned in with what the business needs, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. Especially in the online environment, ITDR typically is the primary consideration here. But did you really did you not think about the physical side to the business? Have you ever thought about how many seats you might need in another building if you lost your building and had to relocate them? Do you have any specialist or skilled staff that you need to consider? How you would replace them temporarily or permanently if you needed to? What about your suppliers? If you can't buy your product from someone, can you buy your product from somebody else? And maybe specialist equipment. Maybe there are some physical aspects in your organisation that haven't been taken into consideration because you were just focusing on your technology environment. Sometimes we find that a lot of this discussion is actually driven through the risk management process within the organisation. Rightly or wrongly, risk management in some ways is a really good vehicle to promote this type of discussion. But unfortunately, there are some underlying philosophies within risk management that don't necessarily align nicely to the business continuity conversation. And one of those elements comes around this concept of consequence and likelihood. Risk managers focus on threats to the organisation, and they think about the consequence and they think about the likelihood of those threats happening. But business continuity has a slightly different focus. A different way of thinking about this is to consider the question, is risk treatment the same as continuity capability? Because that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people implement risk treatments rather than thinking about the broader aspect of continuity. To me, it's not, because I don't tend to consider probability as part of that impact assessment process. And even by definition, consequence and impact are two different things. It's probably the subject of another webinar, I think. The last dot point there is a type of technology you purchase for ITDR. I know, and I've seen it, there are some very, very clever and persuasive IT salespeople out there, and they will sell a bunch of technology to an organisation. They'll package it, they'll make it financially attractive, and then that gets implemented. Again, not necessarily in tune with with what the organisation needs. And typically, it's kind of an overspend. They tend to get more, because it's all thrown in. Now, on face value, you might say that's great. It just depends on how much you paid more as a premium to have all that stuff, bundled in. So what are the ramifications of getting this wrong, or getting your capability wrong? Maybe we can look at this from a variety of perspectives. A good one, I think, given the nature of being an online business, is from a cost perspective. So the following stats come from a survey that IBM did late last year. They went and surveyed, as it says there, 2,316 professionals across 37 countries in 20 industries. They asked a bunch of questions, and the questions focused on what did it cost you to have a major disaster strike, one that you would declare. And the stats say that, on average, if you were out for 20 minutes, you'd lose about $1 million worth of something, revenue or costs. If you were down for nearly 2 hours, it would be $4.25 million. And if you were down for 7 hours, we're talking about $14.25 million. Very interesting stats, and in some ways quite alarming. They're significant, dollar figures for a relatively short period of time. So if we broke this out into a little bit more detail, just peel away those numbers, what they identified was the top 6 cost categories that an organisation would suffer should a disaster strike. The first one at the top being reputation and brand damage, and they were able to quantify that in dollar terms. And so the bars show, the green bar, which is the second largest bar at the top there, showed a $5.2 million loss in terms of reputation and brand damage, which is pretty significant for being out for 7 hours. The next category is loss of productivity. The next one, loss of revenue, followed by forensics to determine the cause, followed by technical support to restore systems, and the last category was compliance and regulatory failure, and these are in order of loss magnitude. If we looked at this from a different perspective, if we just pie charted this, just to make it a little bit more simpler, we can see the proportional split between these 6 categories. And the interesting aspect about this for me is that the business costs make up 78% of that financial impact. So the remaining talks about tech support and forensics. In other words, forensics is the money that you need to spend to find out what went wrong, and the tech support is the cost to you in re-establishing your services, your business operational capability. So 78% focus on financial impact business costs, quite significant. So with those sort of numbers, clearly you need protection, but how much do you invest? And that's in some ways the most difficult, question to answer. So I want to present, a concept diagrammatically. And these 2 graphs will help illustrate what we mean by trying to find the right balance between how much you're prepared to spend and what the magnitude of exposure might be to your organisation. So the graph on the left has that relationship between disruption, exposure and cost, and at the moment that little arrow is pointing horizontally to the left. What that basically means is that if you spend very little, then your exposure to operational disruption will be very high. And the diagram on the right-hand side depicts that from a point of view of your operational capability. So it basically describes this process of running at business as usual, at let's say 100% operational capability, doing what you're meant to do on a daily basis, and then something strikes. A disaster hits the organisation and you stop doing what you're doing. You move through a series of different phases beyond that. The first one typically is emergency response, and that's really about focusing on whether your staff or people are being placed in harm's way and removing them and giving them the medical treatment they might need if it's a physical event, of course. But emergency response is all about understanding what's happening, dealing with it, removing people from harm's way, and then you can start thinking about recovering business operations. And that graph then slowly starts to creep up. The first part of coming back to service is a time frame or a period that we call the survival period. It talks about what's the bare minimum you need to get going to keep the organisation alive so you don't go out of business. And then over time you slowly bring back more and more functionality. You may note on this diagram there's a bit of a hill at the end there, a bit of a hump, and that's to signify that you may have some backlog that you have to deal with as part of returning back to business operations. Bottom line here is if you spend very little on your BC capability, then you'll leave yourself exposed. If I advance this and we spend a little bit more, you can see on the right-hand side that profile changes. It suggests that not everything stops. And we do see this in our, everyday business environment. We know that for some organisations who, let's say, are very reliant on revenue through a call centre, they may decide to split their call centre, not necessarily 50-50, maybe 60-40, as what you might see in this diagram, which means if one call centre goes down, they are still able to take calls through the other call centre. And clearly we need to think a bit about the strategies behind that concept. We obviously don't want to split the call centre across 2 floors in one building. I think the risk is probably a bit too high for that, and so we would tend to geographically spread the 2 call centres. And there are many organisations, as you're probably well aware, that split or even offshore their call centres to create some level of redundancy, or what I would call continuity, so they can always take calls. There may be a capacity issue, but at least they're not off the air, and that's probably a key attribute to surviving the disaster. If we spend even more money, a significant amount of money, then clearly we're really reducing the likelihood or the disruption exposure to, let's say, a negligible level. And again, we see that in our work life as well, in our real life. You know, we'd like to think that if we made a call to 000, that they would always be there and always be able to take calls to their normal capacity, to their full capacity. And in fact, it's true, you know, especially in the emergency services industry, there is a lot of redundancy. A significant amount of money is invested to ensure that, let's say, geographic-based disasters don't take out service levels for, you know, especially for those in the community that are relying upon them. But that's the challenge, right? How much do you spend? You know, where on that curve on the left do you aim? What level of continuity capability on the right should you be aiming for? So this graph here is a way of depicting this concept of right-sizing from a different perspective. We call this the dollar spend efficiency curve. It's a pretty technical term for a very basic diagram, I think. It's your traditional, you know, bell curve there. And we can look at it from this Goldilocks principle perspective. At the left-hand side, if we spend very little money, then at an efficiency level, we may not be as efficient as we should be in terms of relying on our business continuity capability. An example might be that because we haven't spent a lot of money, we haven't invested in redundancy for our call center management system or even our call center, and the reality is it'll take, let's say, 2 days to be able to restart our call center or call center management system. But our analysis has identified that the business actually needs this call center and this capability to be up within 4 hours, not 2 days. So we have a very big gap there that exposes the organisation. At the other end of the spectrum, it is possible, and I've seen it many times, where an organisation can spend too much. As I described before, there could be a service level agreement in place with an IT service provider where the sales guys just bundle a whole lot of stuff together. And they've come up with a nice round figure, and that's what the organisation has signed off on. So, as an example, under a goal service level agreement, all data will be restored in seconds. Fantastic technology. In reality, though, when we've done the analysis, we've only identified that really 15% of our data needs to be restored immediately, and the rest can come up over the next couple of days. It's not as time critical. And so we can see here that we may have spent too much to have a capability implemented. It's a tricky one, though. You know, we know that, you know, year on year technology has, you know, just continues to drop in price. You know, you get more for less, greater capacity, and so on. But again, it's about understanding what your needs are and what you've spent. Ideally, of course, we want to hit it just right. We want to be absolutely efficient. We want to maximise the efficiency of our spend and provide the capability that the organisation needs, based on, you know, how time critical our business activities are. So, how do you identify what is just right for your organisation? There is a process, there's a methodology. That's what business continuity management is all about. And it starts with a business-driven process. So even though we tend to think about ITDR and your capabilities might be primarily driven around ITDR, the capabilities that you do have should come from business-driven requirements. And we do that through 2 key steps. The first one's called the business impact analysis. And it's where we can identify our critical business activities. And you'll note I've used the word critical, not the word important. All business activities are important. If they weren't important, you wouldn't do it. When we're thinking about this space of business continuity, we're talking about how time critical they are. We need to know how quickly or how slowly we need to bring up our business activities. So we run a business impact analysis, and the key word in the middle of that is impact. We look at the organisation. We break it down into discrete business activities. We understand what those activities produce, whether it's a product or a service, and we explore what the impact would be over time if we were unable to deliver those outputs, those products or services, to the recipient. In your case, it could be your customer community. That allows us to tag each business activity with a time marker that we call the recovery time objective. And that is an objective on the timeline. It says we aim to recover or restore this business activity at this particular time point. So if I was thinking about call taking and dispatch for 000, intuitively I'd think, well, yeah, it needs to be up straight away. It can never be down. We must always have someone taking a call. So the RTO, the recovery time objective, should be set to 0. There are other business activities within the organisation, let's say in marketing, that produce beautiful brochures and glossies and things like that, where the time sensitivity is nowhere near the same as call taking dispatch. And we might say, well, really we could have marketing, go off the air for a couple of months and it won't threaten the organisation. So probably two extreme points. And then somewhere in between there you'll have other business activities such as accounts payable and accounts receivable, or even salary payments. So we can place business activities on a timeline, on a continuum. And in doing so, we're creating a sense of priority. And we can identify those with very high priority, short recovery time objectives. They're our critical ones. So once we've identified our critical business activities, we can then peel that open and see what's inside. What are the resources that we need to be available to us so we can deliver those outputs? It could be skilled people. It could be desks and chairs and PCs. It could be software delivered through your network. It could be your network. It could be your servers. It could be a variety of other devices that you use, multifunction printers. If you're thinking about your warehouse, it could be conveyor belts and hoppers and shrink wrap machines and forklift trucks. These are all the things that you need to have available to allow you to operate those business activities and produce the outputs. So we identify our critical business activities and we identify the resources for those activities, which give us critical resources, also aligned to the timeline. So that drives our business requirements. We know when a business activity needs to restart, and we know what resources those activities need to produce their outputs. Then we can look at what our current capabilities are. How long would it currently take to do something? What's the cost in doing those sort of things? So for example, we can have a conversation with IT and say, I've got an application called SAP. The business-driven process through our BIA has identified that business activity 1 has to be up within 2 hours, and that requires SAP. So we now understand that SAP needs to be up in 2 hours. The conversation with IT is to say, what's your current capability? If you really lost the server, the data center, if you're unable to deliver SAP to the business, how quickly can you bring it up? And what are the costs associated with that? Do you have to run out and buy another computer? Do you have to fail it over to a third-party supplier? Is there an invocation fee with our outsourced DR provider? What are the costs associated with that capability? From a business perspective, the questions we can ask are questions like, where would we relocate people to? If we lost our corporate head office, remember, unless you're a real virtual organization, which I haven't really come across yet, there are always going to be a physical aspect. There's going to be people, for example. So where are you going to relocate these people to? Do you have another office? If you have another office, do you know who you're going to throw out of that office to allow you to re-establish the more time-critical ones? How long is it going to take you to do that? If you have to fly people interstate, how long will that take? What are the costs associated with that? So it's not just about IT, it's about business operations as well. So understanding what your current capability is. And it's really important to recognize the difference between the capability that you do have and capability that you don't have. The moment someone turns around and says, I don't know, I've never really thought about that, well, you've just uncovered an exposure for the organization. It does require you to go away and find out what would it cost, what would it take. Some people will say, well, we don't have to worry about it because we have insurance. The downside of that is that presupposes that you're still in business to at the time that the insurance company does all their paperwork and pays you the check. You know, if it takes a week to receive a check, but you're the part of the business that generates 90% of your revenue goes down from minute one, that may not suit you at all. So we've defined what the business requirements are, and we've looked at our current capabilities. Then we can do a simple activity called a gap analysis. We can compare what you need with what your current capabilities are. And in some ways, it can be quite illuminating. Certainly in the work that we've done with our clients, it does highlight a whole range of things, including, I won't say uncovering or discovering, but we find there's a lot of people that have a false sense of belief over their capabilities. And that creates an exposure for the organisation. The simplest way that we do this is we come up with a list of business resources. We list those resources in recovery time objective order. And if we're thinking about technology, for example, I'll present a list of software apps in RTO sequence, in RTO order, and I'll take that to IT and say, can you recover? How quickly? And so on. And we will just match up the business requirement against the current capability. Usually what we find is, I guess like the bell curve, the efficiency curve, in some cases we find shortfalls, some gaps. In other words, the business wants something up in 4 hours, our current capability is 2 days, there is a gap there. But we also often find the other end, where we have a surplus. So we'll identify that the business only wants, let's say, an IT system up within 2 days, but it's been bundled in with a whole lot of other things and it can come up in 2 minutes, which may mean, in fact, and this came up in a conversation a few weeks ago, that IT will be up and running, but there'll be no one to use it because they haven't really thought about their business continuity, the business side of the equation, having to find new accommodation, having to set them up with desks and chairs and PCs and connect them back to the system. So it's all well and good to have an IT system up and running, humming away quite nicely within minutes of the disaster, but there's no one there to use it. So once we work out what our gaps are, we can think about our strategies. How would we close those gaps out? What technology do we need to consider? What are our business processes we need to consider? What are the arrangements we need to consider? Do we look at accommodation somewhere else, arrangements with recruitment companies, and so on? What would it take to actually close those gaps? And at the other end of that efficiency curve, we can think about the surpluses. If we've identified we have surplus in our capability, let's go back to the contract that structured that service. Let's look at the time frame within which we have to think about making some change. Are there penalties of making changes? It could well be that you just have to wait till this contract period finishes, maybe another year or 2 years before you can renegotiate with your supplier. And of course, prior to doing that renegotiation, you should be reviewing your analysis to see what's changed, and always make sure that the service that you're taking on reflects the needs of the organisation. And that process is a bit of a challenge for most organisations. What we're finding is that with the various, the new standards of business continuity that's out there, we're seeing that those standards are highlighting to organisations the need to be, in some ways, on top of their business continuity capability by setting in place a program, a management program, with people being responsible and people being accountable to ensure that the business continuity capability is always in step with the organisation. So, what's the point of all this? A very good question. What's the conclusion in some ways? In some ways, it's not about how much you actually spend on BC capability, because that actual spend equation will come from executive management. They're the ones that for one reason or another, either emotively, intuitively, or through analysis, will say, this is how much we are prepared to spend. So that equation always sits with the executive management. It's more about knowing whether you have spent too much or not enough. It's about understanding your exposure. And I'd say in every case, whether you're over or under is a position, but it's way more important to know whether you're exposed or not. And I think that's, that was really the core from the discussions we were having about this topic of, have you right-sized your BC capability. So let's just wrap this up now and see if there are any questions. Our experience shows that organisations haven't right-sized their BC capability, and in general, it tends to be an overspend on the ITDR, and in some ways it's the only focus that organisations will think about, and therefore an underspend on BC continuity, which is a huge exposure, forgetting about the physical side of the organisation, the people, the work environment, the warehousing, the supply chain, the delivery process, huge exposure. So if you're not sure where you are with your organisation and you need some help, then we're here to help you. And there's two paths we can help you with potentially. The first is a Linus BCM health check. We can do some analysis with you. We can walk you through a process, facilitate discussions, run workshops that will help you identify what your exposure is, will help you understand how to right-size your BC capability, from which you can then think about a solution that meets your organisation requirements. And the other part that we can talk to you about is our business continuity management software called Linus Revive. It's got some fantastic analytics within the product that will really clarify what your gaps are, what your exposures are. It will take you through the business continuity life cycle. It'll help you do your business impact analysis. It'll help you identify your critical resources, come up with your strategies, do your gap assessment, and really clarify what your position is. It'll give you the defensibility that you need to take to executive management if you need to spend money on implementing change into your BC capability. And the last point on the software too is that it's a product that's been around for 13 years. It's strong, it's robust, and of course it's won a wide range of industry awards. So I'm going to open up to questions. I'd like to thank you for your participation today. I hope you were able to take away some of the key points of the presentation. Feel free to contact me. Feel free to contact any of us at Linus, and we look forward to speaking with you then. So are there any questions?